Well, it looks like the world's on fire, and a lot of it is coming from radical Islam. So, yes, we started the Iraq War, and we're going to talk about that here. The United States did. The West has done a lot of things wrong. But radical Islam is absolutely real, and it is causing great damage throughout the Middle East and throughout the world. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the Middle East was not always this fundamentalist. It used to be a lot more secular. I remember it struck a chord with me when many years ago I was listening to a Salman Rushdie speech, and he said when he was growing up in the Muslim part of India, that it was far more secular. And it struck a chord with me because I grew up in Turkey for a brief period of time before we moved to New Jersey, and Turkey was totally secular. Now, with their right-wing government, they're far more fundamentalist. Even Turkey, that was the most secular country in the Muslim world by a good distance. And then Iraq and Syria were not as fundamentalist, nowhere near as fundamentalist. They were deeply secular for a while. So what in the world happened? Well, there are two great articles that explain this, and it has a couple of causes. So let's break that down and share that with you. Kamil Dowd wrote in the New York Times about the role that Saudi Arabia had in this. So let's investigate. He explains that Wahhabism, which is an interpretation of Islam that comes out of Saudi Arabia, is a messianic radicalism that arose in the 18th century, hopes to restore a fantasized caliphate centered on a desert, a sacred book, and two holy sites, Mecca and Medina. So you had secular governments throughout the Muslim countries and the Middle East, but Wahhabism spread like wildfire. It is a particular ideology within Islam, right? And so let's see how that happened. And then he explains, there's no pulling punches here. Born in massacre and blood, it manifests itself in a surreal relationship with women, a prohibition against non-Muslims treading on sacred territory, and ferocious religious laws. That translates into an obsessive hatred of imagery and representation, and therefore art, but also of the body, nakedness, and freedom. Now, those things are true about the ideology of Wahhabism, okay? And that is why it is so dangerous. Now, that does not apply to all Muslims. It applies to this particular ideology. Now, it is the same ideology of ISIS. Now, Kamel Dowd makes a great point. Saudi Arabia believes in the same exact thing. They're just a government. They're a government that we're used to and, in fact, we're allies with. And so what did our allies do in the meanwhile? He explains the West's denial regarding Saudi Arabia is striking. It salutes the theocracy as its ally, but pretends not to notice that it is the world's chief ideological sponsor of Islamist culture. The younger generations of radicals in the so-called Arab world were not born jihadists. They were suckled in the bosom of Fatwa Valley, a kind of Islamist Vatican with a vast industry that produces theologians, religious laws, books, and aggressive editorial policies and media campaigns. I read this and I thought, of course, this fundamentalism didn't appear out of nowhere. It was pushed. It was financed by the Saudis. Now, we had a role in it too. The United States did. I'll get to that in a second, okay? But how did they do it? They did it through marketing and media and propaganda. They did it in the newspapers. They did it in the radio. Let me give you more details. He explains one has to live in the Muslim world to understand the immense transformative influence of religious television channels on society by accessing its weak links. Households, women, rural areas. Islamist culture is widespread in many countries: Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Mali, Mauritania. There are thousands of Islamist newspapers and clergies that impose a unitary vision of the world, tradition and clothing on the public space, on the wording of the government's laws, and on the rituals of a society they deem to be contaminated. You see, if Muslims in their entirety all believed this, well, they would have believed it before the Saudis spread Wahhabism throughout the world. But they didn't. Those countries used to be more secular. That's a proven fact. Now, there's this idea that Islam, in its core, is so bad that it is irredeemable, that they will murder anyone who isn't Muslim no matter what. Like, if they were to get in power in the Middle East, they would slaughter all the Jews and all the Christians. But they were in power in the Middle East for 1,300 years. And many terrible things happened in those empires, the Arab Empire, the Ottoman Empire, etc. but they didn't slaughter all the Jews and all the Christians, right? They're empires. They did terrible things, but they didn't kill them all. It wasn't like, here we are, we finally have power. What does our book say? Our book says, kill them all, let's go kill them. They didn't do that. And then after the world wars, they were far more secular. It isn't the religion in mass. It is a strand of ideology within the religion. So within Christianity, there are nuns who go protest nuclear energy, and because they mean well, and there are nuns and priests who go feed the hungry and help the needy, right? And then there are strands of fundamentalism who look forward to Armageddon and think that the United States should help in that process. That's the problem, not all of Christians and not all of Christianity. Yes, Christianity has terrible things in their text, as Islam has terrible things in its text. And they both have wonderful things. The question is, what does your culture emphasize? And the Wahhabis said we should emphasize the terrible parts, and they spread that poison throughout the Muslim world. So, more on this. Dowd says, all of which leaves one skeptical of Western democracies' thunderous declarations regarding the necessity of fighting terrorism. Their war can only be myopic because it targets the effect rather than the cause. That is so true. Since ISIS is first and foremost a culture, not a militia, how do you prevent future generations from turning to jihadism when the influence of Fatwa Valley and its clerics and its culture and its immense editorial industry remains intact? You see, what he's saying is, you can kill the ISIS guys and then more ISIS guys pop up. Why? Because you haven't attacked the root cause, which is the media, the propaganda, and the culture that they are spreading. You've got to go after the cause, not the effect. Oh, someone using their mind, thank God, ironically. Now, he summarizes this way. He says Daesh, which is another word for ISIS. Daesh has a mother, the invasion of Iraq, but it also has a father, Saudi Arabia and its religious industrial complex. Until that point is understood, battles may be won, but the war will be lost. Jihadists will be killed, only to be reborn again in future generations and raised on the same books, or the interpretation of those books, okay? So now, Saudi Arabia, why are we allies with them? Why do we let them spread this poison everywhere? Oh, oil. Is it really worth it? Yes, no, Saudi Arabia does keep its end of the bargain. Okay, let's be fair here. They help to block oil embargoes so that our oil is cheaper. Okay, that's true. So for cheap oil, this is the price we paid. Do you think this price has been worth it? Now, let's go to our role in this. Because just to blame, in his words, the father, Saudi Arabia, is only half the equation. The other half of the equation is the United States and the Western powers. This is where a lot of people get irrational, go, no way, you're blaming America, I don't want to hear it, okay? For God's sake, open your ears, open your mind, and listen to the whole story, okay? So, let me show you a picture of the Oval Office from 1983. That would be the legend, Ronald Reagan. And there he is with the Mujahideen. Now, we all know that Reagan and the U.S. government supported the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. I think almost all of you know that, right? Now, the part that they don't tell you about is who was the leader of the Mujahideen at the time. Well, The Independent in the UK ran a story about that back in 1993, glorifying a certain leader of the Mujahideen. Let's take a look and see who that is. Oh, it's bin Laden. And the headline is, Anti-Soviet Warrior Puts His Army on the Road to Peace. On the road to peace. Does he look like he's on the road to peace? Okay. And The Independent writes in glowing terms at the time, when the history of the Afghan resistance movement is written, Mr. bin Laden's own contribution to the Mujahideen may turn out to be the turning point in the recent history of militant fundamentalism. Now, at the time, they're saying militant fundamentalism in a positive light. We'll get to why in a second. But The Independent was not the only one talking about in glowing terms of the Mujahideen. Let's go to Ronald Reagan. Here's what he said. To watch the courageous Afghan freedom fighters battle modern arsenals with simple handheld weapons is an inspiration to those who love freedom. Okay. Now, was Afghanistan the only place where we supported Muslim fundamentalists? No. It was throughout the globe. Why? You're about to hear. Throughout the 1980s, the CIA through the Pakistani government, more specifically Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, supported and armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in their fight against the Soviet Union in what was dubbed Operation Cyclone. Well, nothing's ever been more true. It did turn into a cyclone. Okay, and then they took that to other parts of the world. But before we get to other parts of the world, I want to quote a great scholar. His name is Iqbal Ahmad, and he's a political scientist and a historian, and he gave a speech at the University of Colorado in 1998. This was 3 years before 9/11. Listen to the warning he gave us. In Islamic history, jihad as an international violent phenomenon had disappeared in the last 400 years for all practical purposes. It was revived suddenly with American help in the 1980s. When the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan, Zia-ul-Haq, the US-backed military dictator of Pakistan, which borders on Afghanistan, saw an opportunity and launched a jihad there against godless communism. The US saw a God-sent opportunity to mobilize 1 billion Muslims against what Reagan called the evil empire. Aha! You see, that to me, that was a really enlightening moment. Because I got it. It's logical. At the time, they thought, Soviet Union is godless. How are we going to get all these Muslims to be on our side versus their side? It's 1 billion people on the planet at the time, right? I got it. We'll activate their religion. We'll tell them, go fight those no-good atheist communists. So go more towards religion. Go more towards fundamentalism. But now you need to fight them, too. So I'm going to give you weapons, and I want you to be in favor of militant fundamentalism. What a terrible idea that turned out to be. So Ahmed continues, money started pouring in. CIA agents started going all over the Muslim world recruiting people to fight in the Great Jihad. Bin Laden was one of the early prize recruits. He was not only an Arab, he was also a Saudi. He was not only a Saudi, he was also a multimillionaire, willing to put his own money into the matter. Bin Laden went around recruiting people for the jihad against communism. Remember, this is 3 years before 9/11 that he's explaining this. He continues. Bin Laden, after the invasion of, when we went to go liberate Kuwait and fought against Saddam Hussein, we went to go protect Saudi Arabia, put ground troops in Saudi Arabia, but then we didn't leave. And so he says, Bin Laden thought, America has broken its word. The loyal friend has betrayed. The one to whom you swore blood loyalty has betrayed you. They're going to go for you. They're going to do it a lot more. These are the chickens of the Afghanistan war coming home to roost. So this scholar is warning us, this is how Bin Laden is thinking. This is how the militant fundamentalism you helped to create and fund and weaponize now thinks. And he's saying 3 years before 9/11, watch out, they're coming. They're coming. We've made a mistake. They're coming. But we didn't listen. Ben Norton, who wrote about this in Salon in a great piece, says, there are extremists in every religion, but they tend to be few in number, weak, and isolated. Salafism, which is similar to Wahhabism that I've been talking about, in its modern militarized form, has its origins in the 1920s and even before. For decades, this movement remained weak and isolated. Yet in the 1970s and 80s, Western capitalist governments, particularly the US, came up with new Cold War strategy, supporting these fringe Islamic extremist groups as a bulwark against socialism. See, the socialists were secular, and we couldn't have it, because that meant that they were leading towards communism. Capitalism had to win. The U.S. was by no means the only one to pursue such a strategy. Echoing the U.S. policy in Afghanistan, Israel, in fact, supported Hamas, now its sworn archenemy. When the Islamist group was first forming in the 1980s, Israel backed Hamas's militant founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, in order to undermine the secular socialist resistance of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Then, in 2009, former Israeli government official Avner Cohen said, Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation. We started the fire. And we did it to fight godless communism. And now that fire has engulfed us all. And we turn around and, blame Muslims in general. And more importantly, think that the answer is a military answer. If we bomb them enough, or we fund weapons to the good guy militant fundamentalists that are on our side, including Saudi Arabia, that'll be the answer. Does it look like it's the answer? One final quote from Norton for you guys. This Cold War strategy ended up being successful. After the fall of the USSR, the secular socialist groups that dominated the resistant movements of the Middle East were replaced by Islamic extremists, ones that had previously been supported by the West. I guess we should hang a mission accomplished banner up. Look, it's not a completely simple answer. It's not an easy solution like it's the Muslims or bomb them. And it's not just, oh, the U.S. is bad guys and they did it on purpose and it's all their fault. No, Saudi Arabia had a huge role in this. Everyone has personal responsibility that took part in this, right? But did we, by being allies with the Saudis, encourage their Wahhabism, let them spread it throughout the world for cheap oil? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. Did we fund Islamic fundamentalism in an effort to defeat the Soviet Union and create a culture that didn't need to exist? Yes, unfortunately, we did. Now, can we, for everybody's sake, be a little bit more rational? Okay, stop using the wrong strategy, and perhaps you go fight that culture, and you don't fight it with bombs. You fight it with ideas. You fight it with reason. You fight it with logic. You fight it with education. You fight it with secularism. They were on the right path until we derailed them. And that's not just like, oh yeah, they were all going to be wonderful until we stepped in. Look, I told you Wahhabism, Salafism started in the late 18th century. We recognize that it's not like it didn't exist and we hatched it, right? It existed, but we helped it. We poured fuel on that fire. So let's stop pouring the fuel on it. Let's start to extinguish it with better ideas. And I know when you say, hey, let's do education and let's try to get to the root cause, a lot of people go, oh, that's too complicated. Oh, you're weak. Oh, you're this. Oh, you're that. I don't want to think about it. I don't do nuance, right? But in order to solve the problem, get to a better place for all of us, you do have to do nuance and you do have to have a smarter strategy. And we got to get on that road right now. Young Turks.